Welcome to Whiskey Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 996 for March 19th, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
Port Ellen did not have a great reputation within the distillers company. Seems to be very different these days, but at the time, in the 1980s, it was not a highly regarded whiskey. It was not a highly regarded distillery.
40 years ago this spring, the Scotch whisky industry went through a severe retrenchment in the wake of declining sales worldwide. 14 distilleries closed, including Port Ellen and Brora, along with blending and bottling plants. We'll go back in time to look at the whiskey loch that caused the closings and look at whether there are any lessons we should be remembering today. That's coming up on Whiskey Cast in Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's Whiskey Cast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Trying to fit the best of Ireland into one day, huh? Good luck. Takes us at least 12 years.
Happy St. Patrick's Day from Redbreast, proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast.
Hey friends, Gabriel Cardarella here again with Dewar's Scotch Whisky, and I have to say, Dewar's French Cask Smooth is a double-aged masterpiece, finished in apple brandy cask from Normandy to be unlike anything you've tried before. More in a bit.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Last time around, we heard from Mark Kent of the Scotch Whisky Association ahead of this week's budget address by UK Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. Hunt dropped a bombshell on the drinks industry in that new budget. Not only will excise duty on Scotch whisky not be frozen, but it will rise in line with inflation, 10.1%. Kent wrote in the Times after the announcement that the government has turned its back on the whiskey industry and gone back on promises to restructure excise duties on spirits, wine, beer, and cider so that they're all taxed at equivalent levels. The tax hike takes effect August 1st. Taxes were last raised in 2017 and have been frozen since then. Meanwhile, Kentucky's House of Representatives has passed a bill that would gradually phase out the so-called barrel tax on inventories of maturing whiskey. The phase-out would begin in 2026 and end the barrel tax completely by 2039. Local governments are upset because they depend on that tax revenue to fund schools and other public services. The bill is now pending in the state Senate, with just a few days left in this year's legislative session. Back to Scotland for a minute now. New data shows the value of Scottish food and drink exports hit a record high last year, with a value of £8.1 billion. Most of that was Scotch whisky, but seafood, cereals, and other goods also showed strong growth. Whiskey exports grew by 37% over 2021, with demand from the Asia-Pacific region getting much of the credit. In other news, David Beckham's Hague Club brand helped start the surge in celebrity whiskey brands back in 2014, but now there's word that the former soccer star may be stepping away from his partnership with Diageo. The Times of London reports that Beckham plans to start his own drinks brand that could include whiskey, tequila, and soft drinks. Jack Daniel's is out with not only the second batch of its 10-year-old Tennessee whiskey, but a new 12-year-old version as well. Master distiller Chris Fletcher said on a Zoom call the other day that he's trying to honor the brand's past with these older expressions.
Jack Daniel himself had age statements up to 21 years old when he was still running around Lynchburg. And so to be able to recreate these offerings as sort of a tribute to Mr. Jack and his team back at that day that were making the whiskey during that time is really, really special to be able to say, hey, I had a hand in making these first age-stated whiskeys since Jack Daniel was making them himself. That's definitely a pinch yourself or Christmas morning feeling, as I like to describe it.
The 10-year-old carries a list price of $70 a bottle, while the 12-year-old is priced at $80. I'll have my tasting notes for both whiskeys later on. Last year, Bardstown Bourbon Company acquired the Green River Distilling Company in Owensboro, Kentucky. Now they're introducing 2 new Green River bourbons, a wheated bourbon to complement the standard Green River High Rye bourbon, along with Full Proof. That's a single barrel offering that will be available for retailers to purchase by the barrel. It'll be priced at $59.99 a bottle, while the wheated bourbon will sell for $34.99. On the Scotch whisky front, Oban is releasing a new distillery exclusive. Oban Young Teddy is inspired by young Teddy Maclean, who followed his father at the distillery. Teddy Maclean was the first-generation master distiller at Oban and worked there from 1953 until 1990, 5 years after young Teddy came on board in 1985. Young Teddy's grandson, not younger Teddy, but Derek, joined the distillery team in 2017. The whiskey is a sequel to Oban's Old Teddy release from 2019. It'll sell at the distillery for £195 a bottle. In other news, Texas's Milam and Green Distillery has just completed a multi-million-dollar expansion of the distillery in Blanco, Texas. It includes new warehousing facilities and a tasting room upgrade, as well as a significant increase in distilling capacity. There's a grain-to-glass Distillery Edition Batch 4 bottling that's available exclusively at the distillery while supplies last. And Kentucky's New Riff Distilling is investing $3 million to upgrade its visitors center and tasting room at the distillery in Newport, Kentucky. Tours and tastings will continue to be available while construction work takes place. Finally, South African regulators have given the green light for Heineken's $2.6 billion takeover of Distell. The deal does not include Distell's Scotch whisky business, including Boonhaven, Deanston, and Tobermory distilleries. They'll be spun off into a separate company. Heineken will keep the James Sedgwick distillery in South Africa and its Baines and Three Ships whiskey brands as part of its portfolio. The deal is expected to be completed next month. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Just a reminder that the WhiskyCast community app is available to download now from the Apple and Google App Stores. It's a place where you can chat with fellow whiskey lovers and learn more about whiskey. It's free to download and use, and I hope you'll join us this week. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The New Orleans Bourbon Festival kicks off on Wednesday and runs through Saturday. The Graz Whisky Messe, the Whisky Festival Noord-Nederland, and the Cork Whisky Festival are all taking place this coming weekend, along with the Newcastle Whisky Festival, the Leeds Whisky Festival, Whisky Fest Nuremberg in Germany, and the Whisky Walk-Around at Winghop Fung in Arcadia, California. The Kentucky Derby Museum hosts Rabbit Hole Distilling at its next Bourbon Legends Night, March 29th. Whiskey and Barrel Night hits Tampa, Florida on the 30th, and Whiskey Live London is on April 1st. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Gabriel here again. Dewar's Master Blender Stephanie McLeod has been doing some amazing things with cask finishing lately, and Dewar's French Cask Smooth is no exception. It's the 5th edition to the Dewar's Cask Finishing Series. This 8-year whiskey is double-aged, then finished in Calvados casks to blend together the best of Scottish distilling and aging with the finest in French brandy maturation. The nose is sweet honey and citrus in perfect balance. Taste it, and you'll get this unmistakable note of baked apple, citrus, and a hint of cinnamon spice. Now, I recommend it this time of year as an apple cinnamon highball, using lemon juice, simple syrup, unfiltered apple juice, and club soda, or simply enjoy it on its own. Either way, it's a specially crafted reward for your curiosity.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlach and the Classic Malts lineup. 40 years ago, the Scotch whisky industry went through a major shakeup led by the Distillers Company Limited, or the DCL, one of the predecessors of today's Diageo. 14 distilleries closed, including Port Ellen, Brora, St. Magdalene, and Glenerie Royal, while others shut down temporarily. But as historian Dr. Nick Morgan told me, the impact was more than just the distilleries.
Although everyone focuses on the distilleries that closed and the jobs that were lost there, there was also an equal amount of pain inflicted on blending and bottling plants, where many jobs were lost. Big bottling plants in Glasgow, the old Mackie bottling plant at Port Dundas, and the VAT 69 bottling plant at South Queensferry were closed entirely. Jobs were lost at Kilmarnock for Johnny Walker and in Dewar's plant at Perth. So it was a wide-scale retrenchment, if you will, from the boom years that had followed the Second World War, and particularly the boom years of the late 60s and 70s.
What led up to the whiskey loch in the early 80s?
So after the Second World War, the British government, somewhat prompted initially by Winston Churchill, had decided that Scotch whisky was an export industry of vital strategic importance. And the thinking of the government was that Scotch whisky exports, particularly to the United States, would earn foreign currency, which the country desperately needed in those post-war years. So quite soon after the war, the government were talking directly to distillers, and certainly to the Distillers Company, which was had about 60% of the industry at that point, and was giving them favourable allocations of barley, which was still in relatively short supply, strictly on the understanding, well, it was more than an understanding, strictly on the condition that mature whisky stocks were specifically directed at US exports. And of course, in the UK, Scotch whisky was on allocation. It was in very strict supply until the mid-1950s. So everything was about increasing production. And a number of things, regulations were changed. Once building materials became available, distilleries were expanded in the 1960s. Classic example, I suppose, is Kalila, where the old distillery was knocked down and the new one built. DCL did that same thing in a lot of places. Production was ramped up, and sales certainly increased. If there's a very, even if I say it myself, there's a very good graph in my book about Johnny Walker, which shows the increase in Johnny Walker sales in those post-war years. And initially, all the exports are going to the US. There was very little home trade sales. And then from the early 1960s, you get this phenomenal takeoff as exports are growing, particularly into actually Europe, but post-war Europe, but also Latin America, places like Venezuela, which are oil rich. There's so much money there. And Scotch is regarded as one of, a great luxury item. So this expansion in production is met by what seems to be an unstoppable growth in the market. And again, if you look at the book I wrote about Johnny Walker, I talk about the fact that in Kilmarnock, where Walkers had their bottling plants, they could simply never keep up with demand. They could, year on year, expanding, putting in new bottling lines, building new warehouses. Everything just never seemed to be quite enough because the demand was sky high. And then that suddenly all stops.
In the mid-1970s, that changed. As Charles Maclean tells it, there were several factors that caught the industry by surprise.
Then there was the end of the Vietnam War, and there was and the first oil crisis. I think that was about 73. But most important, by the mid-70s, there was a change in fashion, both in the US and in the UK. So white spirits began to come in, thinking Bacardi and thinking vodka. Vodka was pretty well unknown until about then. So brown spirits, Scotch, and bourbon to a large extent, but particularly we're talking about Scotch. It was Dad's drink. In fact, by the late 70s, it was Grandpa's drink.
By the end of 1982, Scotland was sitting on what one Aberdeen newspaper called a whiskey loch, millions of gallons of whiskey with a declining market and more distilleries than were needed. Several had already closed, but more cuts would be necessary. Part of it was the DCL's own doing, as Nick Morgan explains.
The other thing you had, which was very specific to the Distillers Company and to Johnnie Walker, was the result of a long-standing dispute that actually the whole Scotch whisky industry had had with the European community over dual pricing. So Red Label was sold at a different price in the UK to the price it was sold at in continental Europe. It was more expensive in continental Europe. And most Scotch whisky brands operated the same policy, which the European community did not like. So they took the DCL to court as a sort of test case for the whole industry. And as a result of that court case, the DCL decided in 1977 and implemented it in 1978 that they would withdraw Johnnie Walker Red Label from the UK market in order to preserve the profits from the higher prices in the European market. But at the time, Johnnie Walker was selling over 1 million cases in the UK, in the home market, and was growing very rapidly. And of course, whiskey had been distilled for many years earlier based on the assumption that that was going to continue to grow. So you had this collision, if you will. On the one hand, you've got general falling demand across the world, recession-led for the most part. And on the other hand, the company itself had suddenly taken 1 million cases out of the market. So when it came to look at its inventory in the late 70s and early 80s, it was clear that they had far too much whiskey on hand.
Was it a case of mismanagement at DCL, or was it just a case of they made the wrong decision to take the Johnnie Walker Red out of the UK market?
Well, so it's not just the DCL, because the whole industry was affected by this. Obviously, as the biggest player, DCL is going to get hurt more than the others. But I think there are a couple of things if you look back on it. The first is that there seemed to be no thought given to the fact that this enormous demand that had suddenly taken off from the 60s and going through to the 70s could ever stop. Really, the whole industry seemed to be based on the assumption that the good days were here to stay, which if they'd have looked back even over the previous 50 years, they would have known that it was never that easy. You know, it never worked like that. So there was some degree of complacency across the industry, but obviously very much concentrated in the Distillers Company. The decision to take that 1 million cases plus of Johnnie Walker out of the UK market, with all the implication that had for the inventory that they had on hand, it has to be said was a very bad, ill-thought-out decision.
While that decision may have made the problem worse, Charles Maclean says no one could have predicted the recessions caused by the oil crisis, along with changing tastes.
It's incredibly difficult to anticipate the global demand for a whiskey. The whiskey you're making today is going to be sold, whether it's sold as a single or as a blended whiskey, it will be sold in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. And we're talking global markets now. And it's crystal ball stuff. It's three-dimensional chess to try and anticipate what on earth the demand is going to be.
After trying to solve the problem by limiting production, Distillers Company executives made the decision to close 13 of their distilleries, along with the associated blending and bottling plants. With blended Scotch still dominating and single malt sales rare, the decisions on which distilleries to close did not come down to the quality of each distillery's whiskey, but where they fit into the blending portfolio.
The most important people on the whiskey production side in the distillers company, pretty much the same as it is today in Diageo, really, were the whiskey specialists, as they're called today. We just call them the blenders, the whiskey blenders. And at that point, in the early 80s, each of the brand owning companies still had their own blenders. So there was a White Horse blender, there was a Johnny Walker blender, and so on and so forth. And they received some new make samples and mature samples all the time, and were the people who decided which were the best distilleries in the group, which was over 40 odd distilleries at the time. And they ranked them, A, B, C, D in terms of class and style. So it was actually the blenders principally who called the shots on which distilleries would be closed and which would remain open, on the basis of either the overall quality of the individual whiskies or the ease with which they could be substituted by other whiskies that were available, from the distilleries they had. And possibly there were a few outliers where, I suspect Northport in Brecon was one of these, where it was so remote from all the other distilling hubs that there was a sort of logistical sense that it didn't really work to have the distilleries there. But it was mostly on the basis of quality and also efficiency, which they were very good at managing and knowing all the numbers even back in the 80s. I mean, efficiency was always one of the key measures of a distillery's worth.
For instance, the DCL controlled 3 distilleries on Islay: Lagavulin, Kalila, and Port Ellen. Lagavulin was a key part of the White Horse blend, while Kalila was critical to Johnny Walker production. Port Ellen did not have a specific blend linked to it, and it was the one picked to close. At the time, Ian MacArthur was a young warehouseman at Port Ellen.
I was just a young boy, saying young. My wife was expecting our second daughter. And to be told in March 1983 that you were going to be laid off or there was no job for you. What we had to do, we had to go through a phase in and tell people what you were wanting to do in life, how you're wanting to achieve better. It was Grant Carmichael that was the manager in Port Ellen Distillery. He was very, very helpful. I thought then in 1983, I went home and I told the wife I could be made redundant. She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "What can we do?" "If it happens, I said. That year, I was lucky enough to taken in, and then I was appointed head warehouseman in Port Ellen and Lagavulin. Because they thought, well, we've got a young guy here, he's ambitious, he wants to do things, and he wants to do things the way he wants to do it.
Of course, Ian went on to a successful career at Lagavulin, where he still works today. But he was the exception rather than the rule. Many of those jobs were lost forever. Of the distilleries that closed in 1983, only 3 have reopened since: Benromach, Brora, and Knockdhu, with Port Ellen expected to come back to life this year, following delays in construction caused by the pandemic.
There is an irony, Mark, for example, that Port Ellen did not have a great reputation within the distillers company. Seems to be very different these days, but at the time, in the 1980s, it was not a highly regarded whiskey. It was not a highly regarded distillery. And someone told me a very funny story, which I believe to be true, and it's a no-name story. And this person is from Port Ellen and had relatives who somehow had found themselves climbing through the roof of one of the old warehouses at Port Ellen into a warehouse with nefarious intent, I think it has to be said. And they got in there and discovered that the whiskey there was not, as they had thought it might be, Lagavulin, which was being put up to Port Ellen for storage, but was instead Port Ellen whiskey. And they climbed straight out. They wouldn't have the Port Ellen whiskey. So that's the sort of measure of the regard it had. Brora, I think, on the other hand, was very highly regarded, but they built a new distillery next door to it. And they felt that, the new distillery at Clynelish would provide Brora-style spirit very, very effectively and efficiently.
Other distilleries have taken up the slack, and there are currently more distilleries in Scotland than there were at the time of the closings. That has some people worried about a return of the whiskey loch. As Nick Morgan said earlier, DCL executives failed to look at the lessons of the past when they ramped up production. But Charles Maclean points out that the market is more diversified today.
Look at China and India now, which are the big hopes for the industry, because they've got vast populations, and India adores whiskey, but it's grossly taxed. But there are negotiations going on currently to reduce the tax on whiskey amongst other imports. And there are trade deals being done. And if India takes off, I mean, it'll suck up the vast quantities of Scotch. To slightly lesser extent is true in China. The Scotch, in the whiskey generally, but Scotch in particular, is doing terribly well in China, and Scotch malt is doing particularly well. And again, you've got a huge consumer base, and and as that takes off, so and you've got. Well, as I say, it's a truly global market. But there again, we see there are other potential threats. Whiskey is now being made in 87 countries. Obviously, you can't make Scotch anywhere outside of Scotland. You can't make American whiskey outside America, bourbon and rye, and you can make. Anyway, you can't call it straight bourbon or straight rye, etc. But some of the whiskies we look at Taiwan, look at Kavalan, look at some of the English whiskies that are being made, which are absolutely superb. They really are. So Scotch can't sit in its laurels.
Could any of the other distilleries closed in 1983 ever return? Most have been demolished. The one exception is Dallas Dew in Speyside, which has been operated by Historic Scotland as a museum for many years and still has all of its production equipment intact. There have been several attempts to revive Dallas Dew over the years, but the numbers have never quite worked out to justify the expense, particularly when new distilleries are much more efficient. That's Whiskey Cast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the two new Jack Daniel's whiskeys that we heard about during the news. Batch number 2 of the Jack Daniel's 10-year-old is bottled at 48.5% ABV. The nose has touches of cherry cola, leather, tobacco, honey, and oak. The taste starts off with cherry cola, followed by black pepper and a hint of cinnamon, honey, vanilla, cocoa powder, and a touch of oak. The finish is long and dry with a hint of spice, and I'm scoring batch number 2 of the Jack Daniel's 10-year-old a 92. Now, the 12-year-old is bottled at 53.5% ABV, and the nose has touches of molasses, butterscotch, honey, and blackberry jam. The taste is thick and creamy with dried fruits, molasses, and caramel candy, and the finish is long and sweet with hints of leather and tobacco. I'm scoring the Jack Daniel's 12-year-old a 93. Now let's look at a couple of unusual peated whiskeys. Westland's new Solemn single malt is made with locally grown barley and peated using local peat from Washington's Olympic Peninsula. It's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has touches of apple cobbler, a hint of cinnamon, toasted oak, and vanilla. The taste has a hint of sage along with honey, vanilla, cinnamon crumble coffee cake, and a subtle smokiness. The finish is long and subtle with a gentle smokiness as well, and I'm scoring Westland's Solemn a 93. Finally, Ireland's Waterford distillery likes to challenge conventional wisdom and has produced a couple of peated expressions using Irish peat as well as locally sourced barley. Fenniscourt Peated uses barley grown on the Fenniscourt farm and is bottled at 50% ABV. The nose is pungent and earthy with touches of mushrooms, dark honey, and a nice maltiness. The taste has a good balance of smokiness and spiciness with peat smoke, black pepper, honey, and a touch of barley sugar in the background. The finish is long and smoky with lingering spice. I'm scoring Waterford's Fenniscourt Peated Irish Single Malt a 94. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,400 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Time now for our rebranded community segment. I wanted to share a discussion from the WhiskyCast community app with you this week. Chris Ratcliffe posted this, and I'm editing it down for time. I see more and more distilleries opening with different ways of fundraising, understandable for such a capital-intensive business, but it's something I struggle with. Let me explain. If I'm setting up a new distillery, I have a couple of options, excluding making other spirits like rum or gin. I can pre-sell casks, or I can offer a regular release to those people who bought into a founder's program, the sort of program that promises a bottle a year for some years, along with events, discounts, pre-release purchase opportunities, etc. Both of these are great, but who on earth buys into them before the whiskey has been released? Distilleries are now popping up so frequently that there's loads of options, and if it's for an investment, what are people hoping for? That they've managed to land on the next Kurosawa, and that those non-public bottles will become worth a fortune? That they're happy paying big money for young whiskey, or even spirit in some cases? Are early buys in programs a gamble, an investment, or a chance for some fun? Would the lack of well-known figures involved be a draw, or make no difference to your wish to buy in early? Well, that's a great way to start a discussion off, and Ian Bruce responded with this. I think the prearranged award for regular release for a founder would be quite attractive. A few colleagues and friends have invested in casks for new yet-to-be-built distilleries, which is a huge gamble depending on if ground's been broken yet on the site, or if the liquid is going to be of any use, or a third factor I feel is sometimes not considered, is the wood management plan, or the access of casks that your money is investing into. There are some people who have really done well with their programs, such as Glenwivis, but for me, who has never bought into a cask yet, I would like to see some more information or have someone behind it with a track record. And Tyrone Cote added this, distilleries are both capital and working capital intensive, and investing in one is not for the faint of heart, as the payoff is typically over a long period, exposing your investments to cyclical risk. Those are just some of the comments to Chris Ratcliffe's original post, and it's an example of the discussion you'll find in the WhiskyCast community app. Of course, you can still get in touch with me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. We'll start off with a question from the WhiskyCast community app. Eric Mortensen asked this, what do you do when a dry cork breaks? I've let some of my stock go a little dry up top. Well, I've had more than my share of experience with broken corks over the years, and my standard practice is to pour the rest of the bottle into a decanter through a coffee filter to get any chunks of cork out of the whiskey, then empty out the remaining pieces of cork and refill the whiskey back into the bottle. I keep a stockpile of extra corks around for just this purpose. But why does cork work so well as a stopper for whiskey bottles in the first place? First off, let's discuss what cork is. It's harvested from the bark of the cork oak, which grows primarily in the Mediterranean region, and has been used for centuries because it's impermeable. That means it doesn't soak up any liquids, and it's also elastic. Those qualities make it ideal for storing wines and whiskeys long term. However, cork can dry out, especially when it's being used to contain a natural astringent like alcohol. That's why it's helpful to turn an older bottle over a couple of times before trying to remove the cork. While the cork won't soak up any liquid, that liquid acts as a lubricant to help the cork come out more easily without breaking. How is cork harvested? Unlike oak trees used for making barrels, cork oak trees are not cut down. Instead, the bark is stripped off of the trunk every 9 to 13 years. The planks of cork are removed without damaging the layer of wood below the bark, and the planks are then allowed to dry before being processed. Cork stoppers like the ones used on whiskey bottles account for around 60% of cork used each year, along with flooring, shoe soles, and other industrial products, and of course the classic bulletin board. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Download the free WhiskeyCast community app in the Apple App Store or at the Google Play Store, and you can also get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskeycast.com.
Friends, it's me again, reminding you to try Dewar's French Cask Smooth Blended Scotch Whisky. The best of two cultures and traditions in one beautiful bottle. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
The average college basketball power forward is 6'9", which, according to my rough calculations, is 16.5 times my height. I'll stick to aimlessly pottering around in back gardens.
Proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.